the world. That is a mountain. And clean shaven, you're mad into a light pink scarlet smoke.
Hello, welcome to Fall Titley podcast episode 90 something. The only reason we know this is it is well documented, or words to that effect. Today we are taking yet another detour. Do we even do that part where we vote anymore? I don't know. But we're taking another detour, this time into the Totale mythos. Oh, if you're somebody who thinks that maybe you shouldn't overanalyze the fall too much, you might want to skip this one. Joined as always by Mr. Pip, Billy Rugby. How you doing, Pip?
I'm doing a hell of a lot better than last time. Yeah.
Fantastic.
I'm firing on at least 3 pistons today.
Right, nice. And the Pemberton Walker over there. How you doing, Alistair?
I'm good, yeah. I've been going to criminals and government crap.
Oh, well, the worst of times, isn't it? And joined by our favourite fan, our favourite Fall fan, Dannyno. How you doing, Dan?
I'm very well, thanks. Glad to be here. And if you do want anything overanalyzed, I'm your man.
Wait, that's exactly why you're here. It's we're building a reputation for ourselves, but I don't know if we can match you anytime. But let's see where we go tonight. So I'm going to start off by playing a little bit of audio, which I'm sure will prove controversial right from the very start.
Christian Guru Murphy.
Very good, Alistair. Yeah, that one.
Roman Totale 17 is the mental manifestation of the fall camp and dwells underground, while above him trends grind on slowly and sickly. He appears under pseudonyms Cram Totale, Mark Totale Athlete 6, and the Great God Totale. One of the ways that Roman Totale emerged into the world and displayed his true nature was through appearances in dreams followed by sharp pains in the forehead of the dreamer. He appeared with a vicious, twitching face saying, "Thou shalt not scorn me or my pawns." This phenomenon is described in the book Telekinetic Thought Other Beings by Dr. Thomas Pierce. Roman Totale 17, rest in peace, was born in a coal shed in Lancashire under the buzz of a defective street lamp. He was a psychic and former cabaret performer whose body was covered in tentacles. From birth, he roamed Britain as a self-proclaimed professor of speed speech. He is an honorary member of the Wakefield Young Drinkers Club. He is a big youth character cursed with mystical insight. Roman wrote letters to journalists, press releases, and program notes describing the band and their mission. He doesn't particularly like Mark E. Smith, the singer of The Fall, but he marvels at his guts. Roman authored, at least part of, a book of statements known as Underground Medicine. In the book, Roman talks of the Chorazia N, a village said to be negative Jerusalem, and his hatred of following the logically obvious and of detesting current modes regardless of their credibility or quality. Because of his tentacles, he had to go underground. It was as if his face had started leaking.
Well, what a way to start. Just throw out all of the facts we know right now, and that's the end of the show. Anything controversial in those statements before we jump into the texts themselves?
Don't think so. Great voice, though, hasn't he? He's got a great voice.
That's Rob, yeah, a friend, a concubine of the show, Rob Macleod.
So the thing that jumped out at me, though, is negative Jerusalem. I've not come across that one before. And
hold on to that then, yeah.
As you know, Bren, I'm currently knee-deep wading through Blakean poetry at the moment. So the idea of negative Jerusalem is quite exciting.
Well, that's going to raise its head sooner rather than later. So, Danny, jump in wherever we want to. But I believe the first appearances we have are the letters between Tony Friel and Mark that started as early as October 1975. So, yeah.
So are these actual postage letters, snail mail, stamp on it letters?
They were briefly posted several years ago by Tony Friel on his website that he had then. They only stayed up for a short period of time. I think in the end he was prevailed upon to take them down because, of course, you don't own the copyright in other people's letters is the thing. They were written from Mark to him. So they were only up for a short period, but I guess every Fall fan who saw them at the time would have downloaded them all. So so we have an insight into how they were talking to each other at the time in letters, and they use these several different pseudonyms in letters to each other.
Yeah,
So Totale is what Smith is signing off. What was
Yeah, it
Smith
seems to
signing
be.
It seems-
The first appearance is Cram Totale. Of course, Cram is Mark backwards.
Oh yeah.
Oh,
I hadn't got that.
That's why Danny gets paid the big bucks.
And then apparently Friel signs one. Oh, it is addressed to Roman Totale from Mark.
Yeah,
so.
it seems to be. It's kind of a little bit unclear as to quite what it is, because the rest of the time it seems that it's from Mark's side that the Roman Totale or Roman Totale thing is used. So it's not entirely obvious from the letters, but something like that. But yeah, it's clearly an alter ego or a kind of a pseudonym. There, one of the pseudonyms they're using when they write to each other. There are others.
Do we know where Roman actually comes from? What he's pulling on for that?
I've looked long and hard to see if there's any kind of previous use of that kind of name, and I don't see anything. I mean, Roma has got connotations, Totale has got connotations in art and architecture and things like that, but I haven't found anything that suggests an origin anywhere else. But
I made some wild speculations. I made some wild speculations later in the thing where I think it might have come from, but I'm waiting till it emerges. There's essentially three aspects, I think, of the persona, and I think this is the first one, which is just a pseudonym. I don't think at this point it's anything more than that. It's Mark is, and this is where Fisher comes in. Mark Fisher comes in and talks about this meta-textual kind of thing where this happens quite a lot in the fall stuff, particularly with Totale around this era, that Fisher says that Roman Totale is not really an alter ego, but he likens it to the Randolph Carter thing that Lovecraft had, where it's kind of a character. But I do think he also is a persona. I think there's we'll come to it a little bit later, that I think there's three aspects. And the first one is pseudonym, and the second one is where he's a mouthpiece for Mark, and then the third one is the character of Roman Totale and how those three things are connected. I think we'll dig into that as we come through the myriad of metatextual references, as Mark Fisher might say.
I ran Roman Totale through an anagram generator, and it is an anagram of atonal metro, two maternal, and a taro lemon.
Oh,
and learn tomato. So none of that helps at all, but it was fun.
Exactly.
I think learn tomato might nail it.
So the first thing we come across beyond the letters, which the letters stem from 75, so the very early days of the band, predating the band essentially, up to 77, so a couple of years. Mark signs off as the great god Totale, which comes back later. Mark Totale Athlete 6, which I really like, which don't think there's any more references to that. But the first time we really see it pop up, and I think this came from Friel's letters, is in the story of Master Race, Total Psychosis, the Coming of Roman Totale, in which the character Master Race has a visit from some white supremacists, and the madness ensues from there. Friend of the show, Steve, Church of the Fall, has done us a solid, and he has read the story for us. So sit back and enjoy a little bit of Black Country Noir.
Master Race in Total Psychosis, The Coming of Roman Totale, Part the First. M. Rice had had a hard night's sleep. He was tired when he awoke. All night he'd been prone to horrible dreams, featuring some incomprehensible thing, faceless, gibbous and menacing. It may have been the Jamaican resin, thought Rice as he got out of bed and switched his automatic stereo on, wiping out his negative thoughts with a quick upturn of the volume as the full stepping out commenced. He just put some eggs on the boil when the doorbell rang. Oh, fuck, thought Rice. 10 to 1 it'll be some religious nut or the straights from the flat upstairs complaining about the noise. But instead, the bespectacled housewife he expected wasn't there. There were just two men, with suntan faces and light beige raincoats on. The smaller of the two wore a black derby hat. "Good morning, signor," the small one said. "We are sorry to call on you so early." Rice beckoned them inside the flat cautiously. You see, signores, we have just disembarked from Madrid to Manchester flighter. They sat on Rice's sofa as he poured them a scotch each. What do you want? Said Rice, wiping the sleep from his eyes. As you wish, signores. I am a representative from Madrid for the Aryan Knights of Jesus Christ. My friend here represents the guerrillas of Adolf Hitler. We have an interesting offer for you. As you know, the threat of communism is spreading through our country. We will give you £5,000 sterling too. Go fuck yourself, said Rice with a sneer. Signores, there is more, said the little Spaniard. I don't deal with lousy fascists. But, mon compagnon, with a name like yours, we thought you would sympathise with our cause, spoke the tall man for the first time. A name is a name, goose stepper, said Rice. Now get back to Package Holiday before I get mad. The small Spaniard rose, his cheeks flushed with rage, and said, We cannot allow you to insult us in such a way. You will pay dearly. No one will know we are in England. He put his hand in his jacket. My pistola will silence your arrogant English tongue. But Rice was too quick for them. The tall one got 2 fingers in his eyes, and the little Spaniard's gun was blasted out of his hand by Rice's purity gun. Taking both of them by the collar, he threw them out on the street. The noise had attracted many neighbours, therefore making the Spaniards powerless to retaliate. Rice slammed the door and went back to his eggs. 10 minutes later, he had sharp pains in the forehead, excruciating pains that brought him to his knees. The dream he had last night came back, a vicious, twitching face saying, Thou shalt not scorn me or my pawns. Rice fought to think through the blinding pain. What's happening? The pain subsided 10 minutes later on the second. Rice went to the bookshelf and selected the book, Telekinetic Thought of Other Beings by Thomas Pierce, and sat down to read. End of part 1.
And this being Marky Smith, part 2 never arrived. Danny, what's your thoughts on Master Race?
Well, it's a nice little story, isn't it? A bit we've got, but Roman Totale clearly does not appear in the first section. There must have been other sections written, surely. It's just we didn't get them, but I think it's interesting. Bits of it remind me of what ended up in Hey Luciani, in some ways. There's bits of it remind me of that. I guess someone called Master Race shouldn't be that surprised if white supremacists turn up. But
it's a bit on the nose, isn't it? I kind of tried to, without pushing it too far, work out whether the voice that was appearing was Roman Totale, but considering that it says thou shalt not scorn me or my pawns, it would suggest that it's, unless Totale is a white supremacist himself, maybe there is no mention of Totale in this story, and we've been led on a wild goose chase.
The story is called The Coming of Roman Totale, so he's probably still on his way at this point.
Exactly, yes. And so that's that's a typewriter written letter that essentially went to Tony Friel. The band was up and running at that point by all accounts, and then the first time we actually get Roman Totale outside of that relationship is a letter to Danny Baker that of the famous Sniffing Glue magazine, and by this time writing for Zigzag. And so Smith sends a letter in which he essentially describes where the band is at that time and their mission, but signs it as Roman Totale. But this is one of those things, it's still at this point a pseudonym. Anything to add? Is that pretty much it?
Yeah,
really.
It could be a Roy the Rovers thing, could it? A young Roy Race.
Yeah, it's just a letter kind of on behalf of and in the name of Roman Totale for the band, isn't it? I don't know that we've got any other examples of Roman Totale doing that, but
yeah.
So the letter to Danny Baker, then, is this just a promotional thing? Is he just getting the name of the band out there? I'm just wondering kind of what's going on in his head and why he's opting to do it like this, as well as it being like a bit funny to do it like that. I'm just wondering what else he's thinking. Is he like aping other sort of artistic techniques for self-promotion here? Is he thinking about David Bowie and his alter egos, or is there something else going on?
I think there's something else myself. I mean, this obviously was an interview with Danny Baker that got published in Zigzag early 1978. So the band are still pretty new to the world at this point. Danny Baker, of course, later claimed to have discovered the Fall. He did a lot for them, but and the letter is just reproduced. I guess there was an exchange of letters between them, the interview and the publication, and I guess it just written in that name. Miss Sense, and I think we might get to this. There's a later interview which he says that he perhaps got a bit frustrated by the way the Fall was seen to begin with, which was a very kind of political image.
I think that gets into the second, the mouthpiece version, which starts to emerge now. So we move on after, basically as Dragnet is coming out, this is the first time we see Totale starting to write press releases, liner notes, and things like that. And this is how he first kind of emerges. And so, as Rob said in that voiceover, the first kind of thing we get is on the back cover of Dragnet, and make of this what you will. It just says Chorazina End Village, location unknown, said to be negative Jerusalem, from You Medicine by R. Totale 17. That's essentially all we get.
So that's a biblical reference, then, isn't it? There's a Bible place named, isn't there? Called, I can see Danny nodding. You know this, don't you? Go on, Danny. What's the Lord name?
Well, there's kind of some kind of biblical reference, but there's a performance of Spectre versus Rector in which he says. Mark says during the song that Chorazina or Chorazina is the negative of Jerusalem, which then ends up on the back of Dragnet here. But so it was connected in some way to the demon in Spectre versus Rector. The annotated Paul has got the chapter and verse on this. Chorazin was a village in Galilee cursed by Jesus in Matthew chapter 11. There you go.
Yeah.
Nice, interesting. And so he claims to be from the book called Underground Medicine, which Underground Medicine being a reference, I think, in the Burroughs book, which was called confusingly Blade Runner, but wasn't what the movie Blade Runner was based on, or it was only an influence on that. And we don't really get much more about that, but it does pop up a little bit later. But within that Dragnet press release, we get a little blurb called "Why Are You Smiling?", which is basically, again, Smith just, it's not even a mouthpiece. This is just a pseudonym for Smith, I think. He's basically just explaining, but you're moving into this mouthpiece kind of thing. And I think you said, Phil, the pub landlord idea of, this just allows him to say. And when we get to Second Dark Age, this is one of the things that I find in the annotated Fall, possibly from Danny. I can't even write down who said it, but that this is Smith moving into not having to necessarily speak straight and kind of getting over that idea that the Fall is some political punk band and moving into the idea that there's a little bit more to them.
The thing about Underground Medicine, just to be clear on that, obviously Underground Medicine was a song on Live at the Witch Trials.
Yeah.
And it does, I think you said this, Brendan, that it comes out of Burroughs, who used the phrase Underground Medicine in an essay published in one of his columns for Crawdaddy magazine. So Burroughs uses this phrase Underground Medicine several times, and Mark has kind of used it quite deliberately, I think, to connect to that idea.
Yeah, and I think where Mark talks about it a little bit later, that Savage Pencil interview, the Edwin Pouncey one, is really good. And he goes into it there, I think, where he talks about the concept of underground medicine, whereas in, I think, Blade Runner, the book, it's literally about black market medicine. But I think the concept he's talking about with underground medicine, and I couldn't work out whether this was in the song as well, is this, that basically drugs give you superpowers. Seems to be the suggestion that was coming from Burroughs or Smith's interpretation of Burroughs. They make you invincible.
Well, yeah, it seems to be something like that, and that's a theme in several early songs, I think, in the Fall. Of course, the original concept of the Blade Runner was as someone who was smuggled medical supplies. So underground medicine clearly connects to that.
Yeah.
Mark uses it a little bit differently, kind of self-medication, isn't it, and that kind of stuff. And it is a little bit. It does pop up here and there, obviously in the song Underground Medicine, but elsewhere as well.
Yeah, let's have a little bit of a listen. Although we've heard it many, many times, but you can never hear it too many. Let's have a listen to Underground Medicine.
Your nervous system, your nervous system, your nervous system, your nervous system, underground medicine, underground medicine, underground medicine, underground medicine.
So I'm nice tune, of course, but I'm not really sure if it directly links into the Totale mythos. But I'm treating the book Underground Medicine and the song as two distinct things for the purpose of this very very scientific process.
It seems like Mark uses the kind of the concept of this book Underground Medicine written by Roman Totale just as something to kind of pretend to quote from, as a kind of source of it pops up a couple of times, I think, in various sleeve notes or whatever, just a couple of times, just for something as though you're quoting from a real book. So
meta text.
He could have taken it along a lot further, couldn't he?
Yeah,
he could have actually written the book.
Yeah, he could have, and with some people, you would have been like, if this was Stanley Kubrick, you'd think he'd probably had that book written on his desk. But with Smith, it's probably just up here and on a couple of beer mats, maybe. You were saying the Necronomicon?
It was a standard trope with the weird writers it was into, wasn't he? Lovecraft and Howard and Ashton Smith, and that they all invented books, didn't they, that they could quote from to give it that sense of authority.
And I think that's when you get into the third aspect, which is the character of Roman Totale, which we're not quite at yet in the story. I don't think he's still treating him as somewhere between a pseudonym and now this kind of mouthpiece. And we get, he says in the Dragnet press release, which is November 1980, there's the fall from Manchester. So what, right? But this is not the spineless usual. It's the original article. So it's just blurb. It's just advertising copy essentially, but he signs it with our Totale 17 so that he doesn't have to take any responsibility for the words that he uses.
I think is it preceded by the mention in Fiery Jack's Second Dark Age, which is earlier? Is that?
Well, let me see. I'm not sure when. So Fiery Jack is released in January 1980.
Yeah, okay.
But in terms of when they were actually written, it's hard to pin that down. But basically, we get to the song then, Second Dark Age, and this is where, and again, it might have been your comment on the default where they're talking about this is Smith singing as Roman Totale, which it might be the only place he explicitly does it, and he reveals in the song that he's the bastard offspring of Charles I and the great god Pan, and suggests that the lyrics were written possibly by Roman, and this is a mouthpiece from Ez to establish that the perspective of the song is an outsider, but also to fend off the impression that MES is directly speaking from the heart. Quote the annotated Fall.
Just on this concept of being the bastard offspring of Charles I and the great god Pan, I did a bit of checking of this, and Charles I, assuming we mean the English Charles I and not Charlemagne, is actually one of the few English kings not to have any known bastard offspring. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I always took it to mean Charles I because of, I guess, the revolution, uprising, turmoil. But this is what I got when I put my stuff into chat box. This is my one these days. Could it be a Napoleon reference? Because the empire never ended. Is it a Roman Empire thing? Is it Charles I? Is it Louis XIV? Chatbot suggested that the Roman Empire could suggest power, decline, imperial rule, and this symbol of grandeur and collapse. And we're definitely talking more about the character of Roman Totale here rather than the mouthpiece. But Napoleon as his power, I think that's less likely. Charles I and Louis XIV with centralization of power and challenges to authority, and then this idea of the empire never ended, which is a PKD thing, which Phil will obviously know more about, and the persistence of historical influence that definitely could be related to the NWRA. All of those could be in the mix, but this is all pretty wild conjecture at this
Another
point.
one that's not on there that I've thought about, so as we were sort of building up to this episode, is that in the essay by Freud, The Uncanny, he talks about this weird idea of Rome being built on top of Rome, where you've got these different historical images of Rome on top of each other. It's quite a weird passage in Freud. And to be Roman Totale, I wondered whether that was some part of. I don't think it has to be one thing, does it? But it's possibly one of the things at play in his thinking. But the PKD one, yeah, that was a pretty obvious one.
I have to say, I'm alarmed by the idea of ChatGPT also now putting full lyric annotators out of business.
I did have to give it some
told,
nudges. Yes, I think you're safe for a little while. It's pretty vague. It's I posted. I asked it about the idea of the Scottish men in Soho from the NWA, and it said this is from an Al Stewart song, and then told me about Soho. So you're okay for a little bit. And I listened to the Al Stewart song. I'm like, that would be amazing if it was on the same concept. I've got a soft spot for Al Stewart, and it's it'd be I was fingers crossed that he was also talking about the Culloden dead coming back from the graves to take revenge on London, but unfortunately it was about failed jazz musicians. But let's have a listen to a couple of things. Let's have a listen to a bit of Fiery Jack, and also the second part of our story by Rob Macleod.
Roman Total 17 is the mental talks of the Chorazia N, a village said to be negative Jerusalem. Is the story of an uprising that begins part in the F.A.L.L.O.U.T.P.O.D.C.A.S.T. His face had because of his tentacles, he had to go underground. It was as if his face had started leaking. Roman's part in the failed uprising of the North. It is the story of an uprising that began in the estates of the North. DJs began to worsen, and the Germans brought over trains. Tony, an opportunistic business friend of Roman.
I'm giving spoilers there. I'll play that later. Let's have a little bit of a list of Fiery Jack. So I kind of picked the Total's turn version because the idea of a turn is a cabaret thing, and making the connection there that the Total's turns is a series of turns potentially by Roman Total. Does that hold true?
Well, I was just thinking kind of a bit like that you could see the fall as one of Total's turns. So if Roman Total is writing kind of on behalf of the band, almost like a mythic manager, then the fall would be Total's turns, wouldn't they?
That would make sense. So Fiery Jack, we see after Dragnet, this is where I think it really hots up. Fiery Jack, January 1980. This is where the third aspect of Total, the character itself of the rebel cabaret artist, emerges. And so on the back of Fiery Jack, we get this statement, which is communication from Roman Total 17. The statement below was found with the master tape of this record, alongside the last remains of Roman Total 17. It is for you, the reader, to judge its semblance to reality, but it must be remembered that Total's demise had begun well before this document was written. The events which I am about to relate concern the thing that rests alongside me. This master tape is the result of experiments which took place in the remote Welsh hills one autumn. Here the document is illegible. I have not long left now, but I urge the finder of this master tape never to unleash it on humanity. Already the evil deity recall is clawing at my brain. If it is unleashed, the fall is here. The ectoplasm exercised, and humanity can either eat that grenade or face the second dark age. Roman Totale 17.
I think all the Welsh stuff must connect to Arthur Machen. So I think there's Lovecraft in here, but Machen as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, he explicitly says later about Lovecraft in there, but we know his love of Machen. I just assumed that it was recorded in Wales.
Yes, it was. It was Fall Studios in Wales.
Yeah. So I thought that was more of a.
Yeah, I was just going to pick up on the Machen thing because there's been loads of Machen so far, hasn't there? Like the Great God Pan reference with King Charles. I was laughing actually when you heard about King Charles I and the Great God Pan. It's like that kind of nails something about Smith in this period, doesn't it? It's like his interests in that turn of the superstitious and modern England, and the power that sort of sits behind those things, whether it be monarchical or religious or supernatural.
It's he set up a proper miniature weird tale in very abstract terms, which obviously around the time of Grotesque, we've got J. Temperance, and then we move on to things a little bit later by Job Under the Air Rifle, Spectre versus Rector. So there's very much in the air for him at the time. And there's lots of really nice little hints in here that get me thinking about, who is Fiery Jack? And, my brain goes off to it. It would have been wonderful if that was a character and these would develop more, but it would have got very silly very quickly. And it's, again, interesting that he pushed back against the political dour nature of the Fall by bringing in this character and then realized I better not mess around too much. I'm not sure what his thought process was, but at some point fairly quickly, he starts to deliberately move away from that. But yes,
I think that's in the Edwin Pouncey interview that we'll get to, isn't it? Yes. I think.
Yeah.
Isn't there? I'm not sure if it sits here or later on where he says that, and we may already have heard it, where F. Jack has an encounter with Roman Totale. That's somewhere in here, isn't it? I can't remember where it is though.
Somewhere in the notes. It's going to come up soon, but before we get to that, I think I think that's in when he's pushed to give a little bit more biographical details of him in one of the press notes. But we get to Fiery Jack, which is where he at the end he does. It's kind of this abstract song, and we've obviously talked about it on the podcast already. It's definitely dark and political and talking about an entrance into a very dark age, which, making sense of this, that the fulfillment of the prophecy that's on the sleeve. If you play this, you have released this second dark age, and this is what it is. And then he hits you at the end with that great line of I am Roman Totale, bastard offspring of Charles I and the Great God Pan.
I've found I've just found the bit that Danny referencing in the notes where it says the origins of Roman Totale, born in a coal shed under the buzz of a defective street lamp, and then it says an encounter forced him to withdraw from the world. That was in the Welsh Mountains as well.
Yeah. So I've tried to draw some dots together that maybe the events of the NWRA is what led him to remove himself from the world, although that song does suggest that he has a heart attack and dies at the end. But minor plot troubles for people like us, Phil. Our main character dying, that won't even slow us down.
Well, although on the reverse of the Fiery Jack single, it does say that Totale's demise had begun well before the document quoted there was written. So it feels like the death of Roman Totale is quite a long, drawn-out thing. So
I didn't even know he was ill.
Yeah.
The next thing we hear, well, let's have a list of Second Dark Age and see what we can take from that.
Fat copper and squimmill, that return of glass house, and the Arabs have it made. I'll single people are screwed in a second dark age. In a second dark age. I am Roman Totale 17, the master of street, of Trials 1, and the great God.
I don't know if he says the great god Anne, maybe. We have to change, scrap it all. You'll see that'll be like on the annotated file, that'll be like 1,000 messages going back and forth. Are you sure he doesn't say Anne? I listened to like find this obscure like live thing where I'm definitely sure he says Anne. All right, we'll stick with Pan for now then.
The second dark age perhaps being unleashed, of course, seems to be Thatcherism, because all the references you can trace in that lyric are to 1979. Fat conference women is the Tory party conference, and the glass house is the kind of punishment for teenagers, and all that kind of stuff is all very close to the release of the single.
Yeah, there was a lot of that dark political change going on at that time, and he changed his tune though, didn't he, later? Didn't he?
Yeah.
And Mikey Cha-Cha, he was well on board. 3 million unemployed. I don't care as long as we're giving it to the RGs. Next thing we come to is Letter to Matthew, which again he's back in just a pseudonym at this point. Where basically Matthew was dared to ask him for some lyrics, and he basically says, "No, we don't do that kind of thing. But I will give you the scraps that are already on the back of Dragnet." And then he starts to, I guess there's a couple of gigs where he starts to introduce himself as, or obliquely, he says, "Where the Fall meet my sidekicks are Totale 17's sidekicks." He's kind of maybe building up this character a little bit more and bringing it into existence. And that's where I thought was a good place to drop in this idea of the alter egos in pop, specifically Ziggy Stardust and Aladdin Sane. Dave Bowie, they set back English music in this country 20 years. Dave Bowie this, Dave Bowie that. Although, interestingly enough, Nicki Minaj has an alter ego.
I was going to drop this.
Go for it, Rob.
Yeah,
go for it.
I was talking to the other half last night. She started saying, "You're going to be talking about Nicki Minaj." I was like, "What the hell?" And
yes,
she's got an alter ego called Roman Zelensky. She did a track with Eminem. And it's god awful. I listened to it last night. It's one of the worst pieces of shit I've ever heard.
I love it. Yeah, I love it. So it is a bit dodgy calling yourself after Roman Polanski, though, surely. But we're not getting in. We're not going to touch on that. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Maybe she had a friend whose name was Zelensky. So that brings us to, D Bowie. What anything to add about this idea of Smith? Maybe.
Well, he's had a few alter egos. It's a very deliberate sort of thing with Bowie, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's kind of part of his MO and the way that he does stuff. And in some ways, it's quite a shrewd capitalist move in terms of, he's always got a new project, even though it's essentially all just musical theatre, his albums. But he kind of reinvents his characters, doesn't he? Famously, like the Thin White Duke and Ziggy Stardust and these kind of characters that he seems to develop. But they're always quite pantomime, I think. It's that musical theatre thing with Dave Bowie, isn't it? Whereas Smithy's not that interested in the theatrical side of it. It's kind of more of an intellectual concept for him to toy around with, isn't it?
Like backhanded almost to call him a failed cabaret artist rather than Ziggy Stardust, who was the greatest rock and roll star of all time. And Aladdin Sane is essentially just a variation on Ziggy Stardust, from what I understand. But there's a quote here that I got from this thing called Trash Theory. There's this Cycle Trash Theory that did a good article on Aladdin Sane, and the quote was, "Ziggy was meant to be clearly cut and well defined with areas for interplay, whereas Aladdin is pretty ephemeral." And it was interesting, I think. Obviously, Roman Totale was not very fleshed out. It was very much this kind of ephemeral thing that he could wear as lightly or as heavily as he wanted for a few years.
I mean, I'm a bit fussy about me, David Bowie. I don't like all his stuff. And I do think of it, just as you said, Phil, as theatre, really, and it is playing a role. Are there any examples of Bowie kind of adopting the character for press statements or anything like that? Or did he not really do that? He just kept it on stage?
I don't know enough about him. I think not so much maybe Aladdin's same, but I do get a feeling that Ziggy Stardust was there or thereabouts, but I don't know if he ever did interviews in character or whether it was always clear.
I've never seen him interviewing character like you're getting on.
No.
I've only ever seen him it's always like a backstage interview, and it's like David Bowie getting ready to be Ziggy Stardust or getting ready to be Aladdin or whatever it is the show that he's doing. So I don't think he did take it on like that, and I think it is just an artistic thing. And for Smith, it's like, I don't know. There is the artistic thing, but it's like he's trying to make a statement with it as well, isn't it? It's like he's got a critique that he's aiming at it with. With Bowie, it's a bit of fun, it's playfulness, it is cabaret, it is all that kind of show and glitter and feathers and all that kind of thing and wax pen. Whereas for Smith, it feels like he's trying to make an artistic critique about something, and also trying to kill it possibly at the same time, so nobody else tries it. And
yeah, I think it's ironic. I've thrown in a bit of D Bowie. Have a listen. This is him in full Aladdin sane mode, but
do I have to?
one of the
Brendan, if you're gonna play some music by somebody who adopted a character, would stay in character for hours and hours and hours, play some Frank.
Tell you what, I'll play some David Bowie and I'll have a look for some good Frank while it's playing.
Whose concert is this? I do the voice, right? A 1, 2, 3, 4.
All right, I fear we have digressed too far. Anyway, that's enough Dave Bowie. So we get to another couple of gigs. Finsbury Park, good evening, where the Fall, I'm Roman Totale, and these are my sidekicks. So he names himself. He's done it. There's the smoking gun. And I will lead you on to new visions of proletariat posterity. This is a story. And I think then he does go into NWRA. And that brings us to Totale's turn to the press release. And I think this is where, it really cranks up into Totale's on the scene. The beginning bit is just him, again, just setting out some advertising stuff about how great the Fall are. And our Totale says this is probably the most accurate document the Fall ever released. And then he quotes again from U Medicine. I have this natural thing which hates following the logically obvious and detests current modes regardless of their credibility or quality. And then we get into, some meaty Totale mythos. Born in a coal shed under the buds of a defective street lamp, roamed Britain as a self-proclaimed professor of speed speech, and fled from Lancashire and settled in the Welsh mountains in 79 until an encounter with F. Jack forced him into withdrawal from the world. Mental manifestation of the Fall camp, and dwells underground while above him trends grind on slowly and sickly.
It's a great bit of writing, really, isn't it? It's funny, and not many people do this. We're talking about David Bowie and lots of rock and roll artists have adopted stage names and that kind of thing. And you get Captain Beefheart and Black Francis and Sasha Fierce, and Bono did it a few times. So lots of that. But I can't think really. I did look. I couldn't find other examples of people doing what Smith did with this. I just couldn't see anything obvious anyway.
No, I had a look too, and that's where I was reminded of the Roman Zelensky. But no, it's him spreading this character across all these things. I mean, one of the things is that not many people had control over their press releases, their album covers, everything, right? So it's kind of like, by retaining control over everything and basically being the boss of the Fall, he was able to make sure that whatever was doing next, and then it just perfectly makes sense, right? So if you're going to have to like talk to a graphic artist and then talk to the press guy and talk, it's like, but if you're doing all that stuff, then of course one day you're writing a press release, the next day you're writing lyrics, the next day you're doing the cover, and it's like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense that this character just starts to appear in all of these places.
One of the interesting things to me is obviously some of this stuff got on the back of records, but a lot of it at the time would only have been seen by the journalists that received the press releases. So he was very much creating something for them to begin with. Some of these things got reprinted, but the audience for it was small at the time, but he was doing it anyway. And that's interesting to me because writing like this is, it takes time, doesn't it? You can't, it's not dashed off. It's put a little bit of effort into these little snatches of text for an audience of dozens of people.
It's an interesting strategy, isn't it, for him to say, I don't like the fact that we're perceived as this dour punk band, so I'm going to create this character, but then I'm going to kind of feed it not just to the public, but also to the press in strange and unusual ways. It's not too dissimilar to something that became like a viral marketing kind of thing, where you're kind of precog, isn't it? He's like,
it reminds me a lot of something like Andy Kaufman as well, like the kind of stunt that he would pull to, do you know what I mean, like the wrestling thing or something like that, where it's just you're playing with the mechanisms of promotion and perception, aren't you? That's where he's showing a bit of his intellect, I guess, and his creativity.
Yeah. So then we get on the back of Totale's turns, you'd be better buying this one than any of the others mentioned in the handout you're now reading. And we hear the first mention of the yet unborn son of our Totale, who we shall come to hear much more about. So we hear of Roman's death and his birth before we hear about his greatest defeat in the song NWRA. Who is Fiery Jack and what is part in the Totale story? We can only make a guess at that. Now, following the death of Roman, his son Joe Totale began to write press releases from a safe house somewhere in England, or in September of 1980. So this is really all within the same year. But it's just putting out so much great stuff, right? So Dragnet's coming out, Grotesque is on the horizon, Totale's turns is the Fiery Jack single. So totally why press release comes out, there's a suggestion that Joe is a bit more tough and he's a bit more knowing. And he, again, is the mouthpiece. He's basically talking about how great Totally Wired is and how the only reason you'll know this is because it was well documented. Beautiful line.
That's great. I just wanted to reverse a second, because with the Totale's turns sleeve and so on, you've got the Call Yourselves Bloody Professionals thing on the back there, signed R Totale, but it appears then as Roman Totale 18th, so he got his numbers wrong there. But as an honorary member of the Wakefield Young Drinkers Club, Totale, of course, had something in common with Marquis Smith, who was also a member of the Wakefield Young Drinkers Club, and his membership card came up at a recent auction, didn't it? A few months ago. I saw that
on Twitter, yeah,
in which his name is given as Marquis Smith the 17th.
New facts emerge.
Yeah,
interesting. Do you know anything about this Wakefield Young Drinkers Club? Was it just a fun? Was it a football related thing, or just?
Well, I don't know if it was football related, but it was around. I think it was around the Labour Club or one of the clubs that a lot of the kids were drinking around, and there were people associated with a fanzine, I believe, as well. I've forgotten a lot of stuff. I did a bit of research. Some of the people that still pop up occasionally on Facebook and so forth who were there.
Yeah.
And so it was a group of people, and obviously Mark was part of it and had his card.
It's interesting that he aligned himself with Yorkshire. Not something he did very often.
Yeah. Oh, just as well, on some editions, I'm not sure all editions of Totale's terms, there's a run-out groove message which says RT is dead, long live RT. Okay. One of those Porky prime cuts type things, I think.
Rough trade, because I did think that RT, obviously, that was something that struck me early on. Yeah. And I wondered, I didn't go back and look what Rough Trade 17 was, what release number 17. Maybe I'll do it while we're listening to something. So, Sounds Magazine, the big enemy style magazine at the time, got a letter signed from Joe Totale. And then at Manchester Poly, before NWRA, which is being played around this time, this is a story about a rising nil chance as documented by the son of Roman Totale-17. His son's name is Joe, and he was a vicious character who could kill you with one touch. But before we actually get to NWRA, this Grotesque is released, and it seems that Roman left some sleeve notes, a didactic discourse from the shell of our Totale. They were edited by his vicious son, Joe, and he quotes his father, "The fall will outlive your sins." And then he goes on that album to tell the story of his father's greatest failings.
The fall will outlive your sins is kind of biblically accurate, isn't it? If you think about it.
Yeah. I guess if you're talking about the fall in its
original sin.
Sin, exactly. Yeah.
The fall of man outlives the original sin, and the fall of man, of course, followed the rebellion of Satan. So the fall, the fall has begun appears in the lyrics of North Will Rise Again, and I always think there's a double meaning there a little bit. That's probably me overanalyzing.
No, I think it wouldn't have taken Smith long to jump from the Fall, the Camus book, where it started to be like, there is some scope in this name. It holds quite a bit of depth.
Yeah.
We get a little bit on the Grotesque press release where Joe is now talking about his father and the 60% pure prophecy of the songs on Grotesque. Roman Totale is dead. Long live Joe Totale. The last words were, "The fall will outlive your sins." And in the didactic discourse, we get a description of the NWRA song, which Smith seems to have been disappointed it wasn't lauded as the greatest work of creation in history, but there's still time. But he talks about how J. Totale describes the death of his father as a very personal thing, but necessary and to the good. You thought it would be great. And so, we move on, and essentially Joe is kind of blathering on a little bit as a mouthpiece of Smith. Every class gets what's coming to it. And then we move on to, I would say,
That's such a great Wyndham Lewis type line, that, isn't it?
The best, yes. So, yes, the centerpiece of this discussion, this NWRA song from Grotesque in November 1980, which was first played back in May. So it kind of around the same time that a lot of Fiery Jack and Second Dark Age were kind of coming out, just a few months. That's where NWS.
You play this as well, but one of the things I was going to ask is, do you think the stuff that he's doing with Totale is similar to what we were talking about when we did Before the Moon Falls? Where he's like expanding the myth of what a band can be. And in that introduction to Before the Moon Falls, he's on about them coming back from musical pilgrimages, and then it's like they're almost becoming like a detective agency, and then like the Totale stuff is another way of like stretching out that band mythology, isn't it? About what a band can be and how far you can push that identity in the cultural imaginary. There you go. Can't get more artificial than that.
There's something in art theory, kind of modernist art, futurist art, about kind of total art, isn't there? Everything is an artistic construction in different mediums, and you use them all. So why not make the band part of that, I suppose?
Yeah. And I think it was, not necessarily a conscious decision, other than just, this is another opportunity to tell a story, to make that myth. And he clearly loved myth and mythical things, and he's literally quoting gods, the Bible, the Roman Empire. He's bringing all the big guns at this point to this character. Total Roman. Let's have a listen to NWRA.
Happened, we walked through all the states, from Manchester right into Newcastle. In Darlington, helped a large man on his own chase off some kids who were chucking bricks and slash stuff through his flat window. He had a way with people like that. He cussed us and we moved on. Junior Choice played one morning. The song was English Scheme. Man, they'd changed it and did a grand piano and turned it into a love song. How they did it, I don't know. DJs has worsened since the rising. Elaborating on nothing and praising the track, with words they could hardly pronounce in telephone voices. I was mad and laughed at the same time.
I'm Joe Totale, the yet unborn son. The North will rise again. The North will rise again. Not in 10,000 years. Not in 10,000 years. Too many people, cowards and criminals, and government crap. These things stick up like snacks. The North will rise again. The North will rise again.
Roman's part in the failed uprising of the North. It is the story of an uprising that began in the estates of the North. DJs began to worsen, and the Germans brought over trains. Tony, an opportunistic business friend of Roman, set out to destroy the rising. Roman is hiding, as he senses the uprising will not go well because of uprisers themselves, the sickly blind. He is wearing an ostrich headdress. His face is a mess, covered in feathers. He is orange-red, with blue-black lines that drape down to his chest. His body is a mess of tentacles and light blue plant heads. Roman, or Joe, is watching the uprising on TV. Tony has...
Where to start? Where to start with this? Danny, the North will rise again.
It's fantastic, isn't it? I'm sure you've talked about it on the podcast many times. What's interesting, it's pretty basic music behind this though as well, which is really, but it still holds the attention. And the stuff in the lyrics here, when I was looking at it, a lot of the stuff he talks about at the beginning, the Queen Mother hitting town. At the time he was writing this, they were visiting the area. The Queen Mother was visiting at the time. All of this is well documented. So I'm pretty sure that they were playing a song that on Junior Choice that they were listening to as they drove around and all that kind of stuff. It's all quite realistic, a bit like a lot of the songs at the time, Second Dark Age. A lot of the stuff you can track down to actual events in the world, which gives it a kind of a realist edge that it might not otherwise have. I like things like that. You'd only know about it if you looked at the newspapers from the time. But yeah, the Queen Mother was visiting Edinburgh.
Yeah, so the story itself is flashing back between time periods. And me and Phil were talking about this the other day, which is very easy to do when you're literally just writing on a piece of paper. You can play around with characters and types, and much harder, obviously, if you're trying to make a coherent narrative or a film or something. But this idea of, and there was a lot about in modernist literature, and I reminded of things like Catch-22, where you're retelling different parts of the same story from different perspectives, but sets it out a little bit more. I'd like to tell Phil, at the time I tried to read the first chapter of The Sound and the Fury while I was coming down with a fever, and I thought I was losing my mind because it's written from the perspective of a kid who's mentally challenged, and it just wasn't making sense. It just wasn't going in. But once you read it and you pick this apart, like the song here, most of it seems to make sense. There's an uprising. Roman is hiding. He's gone underground. He's wearing this crazy elaborate outfit, which I'll show you my AI generated attempts at in a little while. But it's a beautiful description of the plant heads and so on.
What is interesting on the AI stuff is it's really led into that ostrich vibe, hasn't it? And when I heard those lyrics and was sort of mentally conjuring up an image of what I thought he looked like, it was more of that showgirl kind of cabaret thing. You know what I mean? Because they're always described as having ostrich feathers on. And the tentacle thing I took more as a poetic way of describing some quite fluffy outfits, but it's really gone for the whole Lovecraft vibe.
I went to Artbot and I gave it a few prompts, and I'll try, if it's possible, I'll link these in the show description. But you can see
they're all good value. The other thing I was going to say just quickly is when when we first started to get to know each other, when I first met you, I was knocking around with some bikers. So when I hear the phrase "the North will rise again," the first thing that comes to my mind is all the like Confederate paraphernalia and the South will rise again, and it's like it's a rallying cry, isn't it, in America?
Yeah,
it's about the time period. And which links it into the country and northern music that Danny made reference to, this very twangy, repetitive music that's going on, banjo-esque.
Okay.
Almost guitar on it. And I've always heard those kind of records first in this piece. And then the other kind of narrative that builds up this kind of so you knocked around an article yesterday, didn't you, about the riots that were going on in '79 in Southall and the kind of general milieu of the country at the time. It was the cusp of Thatcher, wasn't it, coming in, or she'd just been voted in '79, I guess, wasn't it?
And there was a big rise in National Front and the Southall riots.
It was a big rise in street politics, is what happened, because it was both sides. You don't have a fight like both sides going out into the street.
What's interesting is that the big riots that we know of, the Brixton riots and so on, Toxteth, were a little bit later, I think, 81. Whereas these earlier ones in London, were very much centred around the National Front.
The article you sent round implied that they were like race riots. But when you got into it, it was left versus right riots. It was communists versus fascists in the street, wasn't it? Whereas later on, you did get things like Toxteth, which were like racially sort of inspired.
Sure,
This is politics in the street, isn't it?
More political, sure.
And that's what he's getting at in this song as well, isn't it? Is the fact that it's a political uprising that's going on. That is what he's referencing to, but it's got this cultural. That's where I took the cabaret thing to be about, is the fact that it's an uprising that starts in the Weimar Republic, where it's based around these kind of free thinking places. That was my take.
The revolution starts in the toilets.
One of the things that people say about this song sometimes is that it predicts the later riots, forgetting that there were the earlier ones.
Sure, yeah. And I was maybe aware, but I'd forgotten that the Southall riots were kind of the earliest kind of manifestation of that stuff during the Thatcher era. But it was just like if you're writing politically charged songs, although doing it through a mouthpiece so that you can say that you're not, you're probably going to be feeding into that stuff. So this is not a surprise, but it's really interesting how he does it. It's a very light and jaunty take on revolutionary politics. I want to bring in Alistair and Ezra if they've got anything to add to the NWRA thing. Al?
Well, I mean, I never really listened to the lyrics, do I? So, I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that you're talking about that I couldn't really get into too much. For me, it's just having a laugh with all this stuff. And I reckon if he was still alive, he'd just be taking the piss out of us for digging it into it for so much. Because at the end of the day, it's a lot of nonsense, isn't it?
Well, it is, but similar to Luciani.
Yeah, there's similarities there, but
Smith took it seriously, though. I think he took this stuff seriously, so it's a laugh. I think he was doing it humorously and joking.
Take the piss out of us for digging it into it in such detail.
But he'd secretly love it.
Yeah,
he'd secretly love the attention. He's listening in right now. I can see him in the vibrations. Ezra, exactly. Anything on NWRA or the Roman Totale mythos?
Well, on the NWRA, I think it's like, on a lot of days, this is probably my favorite Fall song of all time. Not always, not every day, but it's like musically, I just love the swing to it. I love the kind of the way that it changes while simultaneously doing so little. And the description and the storytelling in it, it's really beautiful. And with the Totale thing, it was interesting hearing you guys talking about stuff like Bowie and whatnot. Like, the thing that comes to my mind is Hunter S. Thompson and Raoul Duke, because we all know that Smith was a big fan of Thompson as well, and Thompson kind of used Raoul Duke within his correspondence, much like press releases, to talk in like a different voice, or just to throw a bit of smoke and mirrors across the whole thing of it. And it seems to me very much like, Totale kind of came about in a similar way for Smith, because he didn't want to give the obvious appearance of being a cottage industry of him and Kay Carroll. He wanted to project an image of a shadowy organization with many fingers and many pies.
Sinister,
yeah. And so, I feel like that's kind of how it came about. Obviously, it came about through interband socializing, I guess. But and then, it gets fleshed out to the point of the NWRA, and then he gets a bit tired of it and knocks it on the head. One of the great things about this whole kind of modernist prose thing is that you never actually have to finish anything, and I'm sure that Smith took full advantage of the fact that being a modernist writer meant you could just write a couple of pages and then just leave it on your shelf forever. And power to him for that.
Part one, everything's part one, isn't it?
Yeah.
Did any of you had a view on, because you've got the first bit where they're kind of touring Darlington and Newcastle and Edinburgh, and then it goes into I'm Joe Totale. Do we think that Joe Totale is the one who's touring Darlington and the North, and then he comes in and says who he is, or do we think it shifts between Mark or the narrator and then Joe and then the rest of the story? I've never quite worked that out, because there's a reference to kids smashing windows, and it says she had a way with people like that, which I've always thought was probably supposed to be Kay Carroll, but I just wondered whether it kind of breaks in as Joe halfway through there.
I don't know if it's as neat as that. I think
no, probably not.
I tried to parse it to some degree, and then there'd just be a line later that was like, this sounds like it was said by Roman or somebody else. Ostensibly, I treated it as basically like the beginning part was Roman kind of saying stuff, and then basically once it does switch to I'm Joe Totale, the rest of it is him. But then it didn't quite make sense that Tony then turns up in his apartment and they have a fight, because it's like, have we now flipped back and he's watching? And I think this was your narrated Fall, where somebody was going on about how the possibility of somebody's unborn son could be commenting on something, the unborn are not known for their conversation or something along those lines.
Yeah.
I always felt like the first part is like a kind of man on the street. It seems like it's adapted from maybe Smith's tour diary or something, but it's man on the street. You experience this from, the kind of position of the layman as such, and then we switch into Totale's stuff. One thing that I've noticed is a lot of all this as yet unborn son, father, dead stuff, it all feels like it comes from the Can song Mushroom. Do you not think? Because he does this in a few songs that I've noticed recently. And, what was it in what's the can lyric? When I saw Mushroom Head, I was born and I was dead. It just always feels like, well, not always, it only occurred to me recently, but it feels like it all kind of blooms like a spore from Mushroom Head somehow.
That's a good call, because I think you can just flip on a switch. If you're writing, suddenly I'm changing perspective. I don't need to be particularly clear who's saying it. But I think the best thing I've heard to make sense of it is that he's potentially looking back from many years, and he's talking about at the time when Roman was doing this, he wasn't born. But that doesn't make sense with the earlier stuff where he's literally writing as the unborn son of John. But I don't think it's supposed to, it's allegorical, it's metaphorical, it's symbolic.
It's been interesting since we did all the stuff with F.A.L.L.O.U.T.P.O.D.C.A.S.T, he started to pick up on these little mechanisms that he uses in the text. Like every time he shouts the word shift, you think there's some kind of time shift going on, or it's a character shift or something. So I think that's a big clue in the middle of it, isn't it? But it's I also almost going back to what Al said, I think sometimes he's deliberately slippery in some of this stuff, isn't he? He's been playful with some of it. I mean, you can have an overall intent with what you're doing it and have some tactical silliness in the language that you're using from time to time. So I think there's a dollop of that going on.
But I think that's why you do investigate these things, and there is fun to be had in it, right? And so Smith, I think Smith was more invested in this stuff than just doing it, dashing it off and throwing it. Maybe he actually did that, but he felt in his heart, I think, if you read the Writer's Guide to Writing, he takes writing seriously. He wants you to analyze it.
You said this when we were doing the stuff on the Hail and Shiny script, and without a shadow of a doubt, he had a golden thread in his head of a story that he was telling with that. And you can see it. The longer you spend with the actual words, the more clear it is what he's trying to do. And that's modernist art, isn't it? That's what we keep going back to with all this stuff, is that these are modernist strategies in terms of how you can tell a story. Or
it's easy to dismiss, right? And you can if you want. That's absolutely the case, right? But you don't want to be saying, well, I don't bother looking at that stuff in any detail because it's nonsense. But you can say that. Al said it, and he's entitled to his opinion. But what you don't want to say is people who do dig into it are wrong because they get different gold out of it, right? So it's kind of, I think, you spend as much time with it as you want and dig, but at the end of the day, we're not saying Mark Smith wrote this and wanted us to pass over it and dig into it and get the final answer. But that's what we did. We've cracked it, lads.
Just as someone who does dig into things way too much, I feel like I ought to say it is fun to do it, and you find stuff like what were the colour of the metro trains at the time? They were yellow, and then I like that. So there's a realism, but this song, although the fact it shifts time and you're not quite clear necessarily who's talking all the time, and he will have moved verses around and taken stuff out just to mess with us because that was part of his strategy. But this is actually one of the more straightforward story songs that he does. Some of the others are much more difficult to work out. Even Spectre versus Rector, it's much harder with that even to kind of work out quite what's going on where and what the episodes of it mean. So this is in some ways one of the simpler forms that he's written, I think. Given that he did story songs in the team.
Definitely agree with that. I was going to ask what people think of his politics in the song. Do you think he's being cynical? Do you think is it of its time? Is it is there something that he is trying to get at that's quintessential about the North always losing, or is it do you know what I mean? What's the subtext of
I think he's taking a kind of an ironic position. I think it is kind of saying, wouldn't it be, imagine what a modern day rebellion of the North would look like, and it could be a kind of Roman Totale-esque carnival kind of libertarian kind of revolution, but it would probably go wrong. It'd probably be co-opted by the likes of the business friend Tony. You'd have the bloodthirsty revenge in Soho, So I think there's a kind of a sense in which he's wanting to imagine a future, but aware that it probably won't turn out like that. So I don't know. I mean, it's difficult to read a political position into it, but because there isn't one there. But it is kind of, there's something. He's referring to something that a lot of people would kind of want, and perhaps he would want in some way. But it's kind of saying, but it'd go wrong.
Recently, I've kind of read it as his like broadside against Tony Wilson and the kind of gentrification of Manchester, because like Manchester was obviously, I guess, around that time going through a bit of a boom because you had the Joy Division and Buzzcocks and the Four themselves, and it continued to go as like a cultural centre. I'm not sure from what time the Smiths start to figure into it, and like I kind of read it as like when you're playing London at its own game and playing the music industry at its own game, then you're going to lose all of the things that make the specific location so special. And like he's kind of showing it as a kind of an almost occult site, like or not specifically in this song, but like in other tracks, like maybe City Hobgoblins or many others. And so like that's kind of how I was thinking about it today when I read the lyrics one more time.
Good try, but I think it's very clearly precog for New Labour. There's only one Tony it could be. So in parts of America they're in, during the NWRA part, he says this. I'll play you what he says actually.
So clear my ideas. I know when he noticed it out on the road. And Tony, he just ripped off Totale. He's been ripping off that guy for so long. He's been ripping off that guy for so long. And I can't tell the difference from Totale and Tony's songs.
So he says, he went and ripped off my ideas. Tony, he just ripped off our Totale. He's been ripping off that guy for so long. I can't tell the difference from Totale and Tony's songs. Shots fired, but at whom? Probably like let's. I'm taking that's as close as we're going to get that it's Tony Wilson.
That's the smoking gun right there, isn't it?
Yeah.
But the smoke obscures the target.
Yes.
In this version, he's like saying something as well in the choruses where it's like, is he saying "chow"? I mean, it sounds like it's almost just like a kind of speed-addled noise, like "chow, chow." But listening again to that today, I was like, is it meant to be like "chow"? Like as in yuppie talk, like maybe Tony Wilson would sing "chow."
Could be
to people.
Very good. There's this idea that the NWRA stands for the Northwest Republican Army, which maybe is an allusion to the IRA and the Irish connection. There's nothing in the song that I can see of that, and the uprising is not a terrorist one in that sense, if that's how we would refer to those. It is much more. It's unclear as to how the uprising even succeeded and then failed. To be honest, it all happened in the shadow.
He's not provided enough detail of the precise political evolution of this revolution, has he? Where does it come from? Where does it go? And why does it fail? I think it's impossible to see NWRA and not think of IRA, and he would have known that. But on the other hand, it would have been quite a long title if he'd left it.
Yeah, this idea
you can't write that and not have IRA also somewhere. But no, it's not that kind of thing at all. No.
Other than knocking shop staff off ladders and that kind of
raising the Arndale.
Exactly. Yeah. It would have been one thing if he'd have said raising the corn exchange, wouldn't it? But that's
right.
That would have been quite a powder keg. But revenge for the Culloden dead is something he brings up in Backdrop, which has led some people to suggest that Backdrop may be a sequel to NWRA because it does to follow a similar idea of moving through different temporal and character perspectives, and it does go back to this idea of the Jacobite rising, which again is hinted at in the North will rise again. I wasn't sold that Backdrop had that many connections. I think it maybe just followed a similar format, a similar way to approach themes.
Yeah, I feel like Backdrop is more about time streams colliding and leaking into each other more than anything. If you're gonna try and do that, but he clearly had an interest in the Jacobites and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, Civil War and so on.
And so the time thing is very explicit in Wings and maybe a few others, but Wings for sure, which is more sci-fi, I guess, rather than this speculative futures and pasts. Mark Fisher, as we mentioned a few times, writes some very interesting stuff on that, but I think we've covered the majority of it. And essentially, though, we leave Roman's fate. He has a heart attack at the end. There's a suggestion that maybe he dies, but then we find out that backwards in our timeline, but forwards in his, he must have ended up in the Welsh hills somewhere before he met his end, and he was forced underground yet again by F. Jack. And then the next time we hear about him is in Bolton, of all places, when he says, this next one's about Joe Totale entering the World Darts Championship. Unfortunately, we didn't get NWRA Part 2, in which we found out quite whether he hit a bullseye like Jim Bowen.
I can't remember quite what I did here, but I remember looking at whether the World's Dart Championships was taking place at the time of that Bolton gig or not. I can't remember what I concluded, but it will have been a real world reference, I'm pretty sure. So it could have been, maybe the World Darts was being done in Bolton. I can't remember.
I imagine something like that.
While you're Googling that, man. I was going to ask, the Fiery Jack reference that keeps coming up. I can't remember where I've seen it, but I've definitely seen some kind of link to that being like, and it makes the thing about it being about all drinkers, but like it being a reference to devils, like Fiery Jack in the Fiery Ring and all that kind of thing. And it's like, I wonder, is that reference to it's not the same thing, but in his head, like the whole Great God Pan link with this is like the kind of supernatural bit that's going on, and then Fiery Jack being like a supernatural comeuppance at the end.
Could be, couldn't it? There's a lot of Johnny Cash in Fiery Jack as well, but
again, I think it's a very it's just a little sketch. The Fiery Jack, it's not really too much in there, other than he does suggest.
It
sounds
like a folk devil kind of name, though, doesn't it?
Yeah. Lucifer of Lancashire. We know that he's not
But one thing to notice there in the lyrics, I said, "Eat this grenade." You'll recall that from one of the Totale texts.
Yeah.
So make of that what you will.
Yeah, put down left wing tirades. So that would bring him into conflict with Roman, who was leaning a little left from what we think, as some other people have been on this show.
Fiery Jack was also a heat rub that they used to use in sports for injuries.
Indeed.
Back in the day.
Yeah, I've got an old tin of that. Yeah.
Devil's heat rub.
So then the next thing we come across is in January 81, and we're kind of coming towards the end of the R Totale and J Totale story, and this is with Edwin Pouncey, who's Savage Pencil, and who did the cover for Why Dream of Casino Soul, amongst other things. I'd love to get him on here and quiz him about that kind of stuff. And but Smith reveals quite a few things to me. Obviously trusts Pouncey, and he lets him in on quite a few things here. And he's basically saying that there's an irony in it where you make extreme statements and it can actually mean the opposite, which, obviously he was very good at. And he talks again, as you said there, Phil, about the South will rise again, and country and West, and then he throws in that because he's talking about Manchester, the Irondale Centre, and this mythology, ties in directly to the idea of Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. So it wasn't just so it was deliberate by the sounds of it to build this mythos. Touches on the underground medicine stuff from Burroughs, Yeah, and then he basically talks about how he doesn't want to basically go too much into it because that's part of the attraction, and he wouldn't have left us anything to talk about, would he, if he'd spelled it all out? So thanks for that, Mark. But then he says, I killed him off. The rap on the back of Fiery Jack is the manuscript that Roman Totale left. It's Macken's influence. It's Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos. I've always imagined him as some sort of a big youth character, cursed with mystical insight. I love that idea. So let me play you some Big Youth. I'm assuming he means the same Big Youth that is the reggae artist.
Vital, that's what the ital galore. We say the ital vital and the ital galore. So the dead get a blow. Ital and we go. Gonna pick up stuff, you know. That is real and trade. Them trade in the rhythm.
I will praise thee, O Jah, with all my heart. I will ever praise thee continually. It was the same say to ask, why do the heathen rage and the people imagine vain things? It was the same false kings that set themselves and the false rulers to counsel together against his imperial majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie I. Said the illness times appointed, your reign on earth is now. Jah came to break down pressure and to set high.
So that was Natty Cultural Dread and All Nations Bow. And the reason why I chose that All Nations Bow, the delivery, very similar to Smith's delivery in NWRA, could be a total coincidence, but that delivery and the actual concept of that song is very much about uprising and rebellion, which, a lot of reggae songs are, but this... I just thought it was very interesting parallel to that, and for him to say, Roman Totale was a big youth character. Because Big Youth, I've seen a few interviews with him. He's a gregarious chap, and it's interesting. Wasn't sure where to go with that.
No, but we know not just from this quote, but from elsewhere that Mark was a big fan of Big Youth and
yeah.
But it's not an obvious connection, is it? If he hadn't have said it, we wouldn't have guessed it.
There's nothing in there that suggests that this character, Roman Totale, is a Rastafarian who's, mystical.
The only thing I can think of is the tentacle head might be a kind of mythic dreadlock of some kind. But
it could be. But it's an interesting, rich kind of addition to how we imagine these characters. And then it says that Currency asks, with Totale killed off, is Joe now taking over? And Smith reveals a little bit more. He says, Joe's sort of halfway there. I don't know whether to carry on with him because a lot of the new stuff we're doing is very hard-hitting, realistic, class-oriented stuff. And I think if you do look at what happened then, as they went into Hex, perverted by language era particularly, I think that very much is the case. He said, Totale was always the Fall's escapist bit, which I thought was really healthy when we disagreed with the heavy realist image that was perpetrated by the Fall, about the reality of unemployment and that sort of crap that connected us to the factories. Totale was a different thing from the image. I'm a dreamer sort of person. I used to resent being associated with realist bands. I didn't like that at all. Then this fantasy thing happened in the music scene where it's all escapism. And of course, I reacted to that. So I guess that's true if you get into 81, when you're into post-punk and especially the new pop stuff where Scritti Politti go from 1 minute they're living in a squat and they're all agitprop, and the next thing they're on top of the pops. I reacted to this, which is where Joe Totale, who is our Totale's tough son, is an MI5 agent, comes in. It's just Joe narrating in the NWRA how his dad came to a bad end because he was naive enough to still believe in people.
Yeah, we what we don't get is any further songs using the Totale name or Joe Totale, it is kind of the end of the road, isn't it, at this point?
That's true. However, fast forward to 2007 and the song Smith and Mark, which is an early version of Exploding Chimney off Imperial Wax Solvent, and he does drop in the following lines. What does he say? He says, Totale will never be captured, never. His spectre of knowledge cannot be encapsulated within the confines of its 2-bit skin. Remember Culloden. And yes, 2007. So what's that? For who can do the maths from 1980 to 2007? That is 27 years, essentially, that I kind of assumed that he would just come across some old notebooks, so he just remembered what he said in NWRA.
Well, there's a reference in there to Standing in the Rain as well. There's a bit of rain in North Will Rise Again. It has to be a callback. There is the bit that appeared in the Hey Luciani program in 86 or whatever it was as well, wasn't there? But
yeah, so he signed it, didn't he? He signed the author, the bios of the bands as our Totale, which was interesting. Let's have a listen to Smith and Mark, even though it's only in on a technicality.
Totale will not be captured. Never! His spectrum knowledge cannot be encapsulated within the confines of its treatment skill. Remember Colorado! The workman.
It's interesting that he did drop it in the end. Maybe it was just some placeholder lyrics until he got his act together. When you think of the other potential alter egos he's tried on in the past, Hip Priest is one that comes around, and especially the Crying Marshal that they played around with it for a little bit, where he said he was going to expand on the idea of the Crying Marshal, and then again we only ever got part one.
Well, I've always thought he eventually became his own alter ego, didn't he?
He did. The idea of how much Marquis Smith became the character of Marquis Smith. Yeah, pretty early on.
The Stuart Lee thing, isn't it? Stuart Lee's become an alter ego of himself.
Yeah, and he's very explicit about that. But I think Smith knew, right? You know, there's another thing where he's like, well, he kind of actually quite liked bands like The Wedding Present and maybe even Pavement, dare I say, at times, but he could never ever. Probably not Pavement, but he would never ever admit, because he was just setting his stall at like, we are the Fall and we are this thing and you cannot encroach on these walls. You are all shit. And if it was someone who's really different, there wasn't a threat. Sure, you could go on all day about Big Youth and you could go on all day about like Italo Disco, but anybody who played guitars and sung their words, Wire, no fucking chance. Gang of Four, shite.
Competition, isn't it? That's the thing.
Competition, right? So I think the very last thing we've got is
Crying Marshal was.
What's that? Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, I reckon the Crying Marshal was a gambit to sell records. You know, like I feel like he felt like Totale had a certain amount of gravitas, and he felt like he was a bit down on his luck, and so he was like, right, I'm gonna bring in a new character, and then just did fuck all about it.
It's my Sergeant Pepper. Maybe
there are some other characters, pseudonyms, names that we've not mentioned. So around Bricks and Adult Net, her first record, which had some of the Fall on, they all used pseudonyms to do that. And there's the Count Gunther Holingen pseudonym.
Of course, right? Yeah.
So there are some other ones, but they're very specific purposes that didn't carry on really.
Yeah,
different purpose to them.
So I think we're coming towards the end here. There was an interview with somebody in 1982 in a fanzine where he kind of he basically says that they don't do that anymore, but he does let in that Roman Totale was a philosopher and his son Joe betrayed him. In the dreams, it was mythology sort of thing. Joe Totale was like a joke almost. You can use him as a comparison for these fucking skinheads, which is pretty direct to say, you know, Roman was this beautiful ostrich-headed creature leading the revolution of spirit, and Joe sold that shit out because it didn't work. I'm not really sure how Joe fits in as a skinhead, but you know.
I'm wondering if he's remembering his own dreams properly there. I don't think Joe sold out his own father. We've not heard that anywhere before, have we?
No, but the idea of like selling metaphorical or like in terms of Joe became this kind of aggressive, vicious, violent uprising versus
when you were describing it before, I did think to myself that it's like he has to define himself against whatever it is that's currently pissing him off, isn't it? And it's like, so Roman Totale has done that as a fantasy to position himself against the realist band slur that he's taken, and then Joe Totale comes out as a way to position him against the fantasy thing that he's now seeing as the current enemy. And then just to get dead at the end, he's just flipped on what Joe Totale is. He's no longer an MI5 agent, he's now a skinhead. And just so he can take a position against whatever is currently pissing him off. So there's definitely a trend there.
And it's a very good, although, you know, obviously it does seem a little bit calculated if you do it every time you need a little bit of energy or a little bit of push. But, you know, anger is an energy and it's good to be against something. It's just like, he seemed to believe it true, which is where it's like, you know, if you turn on a sixpence and you're suddenly against whatever was happening, you might not fully believe it, but he seemed to be able to be like, nah, it's real. So then I think other than this Myth and Mark many years later, the NME article in 1983 was the very last thing that we've got with Mark talking about it. And he said, I just wanted to character I could talk through without it actually being Mark Smith talking, which is the only comment Mike will make about the now deceased Totale. Yeah, he talks about how this is where the fall generally past all understanding has stepped over into the realms of the sublime. But yeah, he in the end he came good. He told us that it was all a scam, and Alistair was right. We've wasted our time once again. I'll just
was it though? I mean,
oh yeah,
there was some new facts that emerged earlier on today while I was searching for Roman Totale, and it seems that he's given up on philosophy, faked his own death, and is now selling what was it?
Rolls Royce.
Rolls Royces. Yeah, sorry, I'm not good at cars. But yeah, so you know, I mean, that's how all the big philosophers end up, right? Isn't it? Like used car salesmen.
I know. I mean, it's the same thing, basically, isn't it? After the passing of Mark, a band called Utopia, a band called Martin and Bell, did an album called Utopia. You know, it seems that the guys here had something to do with. Oh, I lost it. They had some connection back in the day to a fanzine or a venue that Mark had a connection with. And they're
Gavin Martin?
I think so, yeah.
Well, he started out on Alternative Ulster.
That's it. Alternative Ulster. So then he then wrote this this song, and maybe we can maybe play out with it. It's definitely different to the Fall style, but you know, he's basically, it's a tribute to Mark. With some hints, random hints of Roman Totale, so it seems quite fitting. And I think that's all we've got. That's been plenty. That's been nearly 2 hours talking through the I think we've done it. But you were saying, Phil, you were surprised that it wasn't, there wasn't a place to get all this stuff in one place. Now, one of the threads on one of the chat boards that Danny, you were kind of overseeing was where I got a lot of this stuff. So there is bits out there, but now this is done, no one ever has to do it again. Anyone who says, I really want to know all of the details of Roman Totale, send them over here.
Well, I had a very quick chat with Danny before we started. I was just saying that apart from NWRA and the album title Totale, I didn't really think there was much else out there. So I've been quite looking forward to today. When I heard that you two had kind of put your heads together and done all this compiling, because the first thing you do is Google it, isn't it? And I was assuming there would be an article out there that our journalist or our blogger had written about sort of Roman Totale. So today's been really interesting. I think it's one of those, again, it's another one of those things that needs decoding, isn't it? And it's kind of a weave of things rather than anything particularly defined. But I think it's fascinating. And it's great how he stretches out what being in a band can be, what a song can be, and what performance can be on the stage. It's still very exciting to dig into that.
Well, I think there's a lot more to it than I think. I think we've pretty much gathered everything here. I'm not, unless something else comes up in one of those auctions. I think we've got everything that's out there here, so that's pretty good, and plenty of us to talk to. As I said earlier, I couldn't find, and I don't know of any other rock artist that has done something quite like this. So it's as far as I know, we can't be relatively unique, can it? But as far as I know, it's unique. But perhaps someone listening to this will know of somebody that has. But I couldn't find anything.
I thought what Ezra said before actually was a good shout. The Huntress Thompson thing, I'd not thought about that. That's a good shout. But yeah, I mean, again, it's another field, isn't it, of writing?
Yeah.
It's within rock and roll as well. I don't know how familiar they are or how similar they are, but we've got Henry Rawlinson, who inhabited the body of what's his name, Vivian Stanshall from the Bonzo Dog Band, and Dr. Octagon, who I believe did get
Paramedic Fetus of the East.
That's right.
There we go. So there are a few that get close.
There's alter egos left, right, and centre. Some better than others, but this kind of as Fisher said, metatextual. The mythos thing is delightful. Yeah, I'd love to hear if anyone else had pursued that madness more. And I think maybe next week when the auctions come out and we get the 300-page edition of the rest of the Master Race story, chapters 2 to 14, we can do another episode. Alrighty, I'm going to play the Roman Totale's Death Song by Martin and Bell, and then we can say our goodbyes. Danny, as always, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thanks for the invite.
Yeah, and if you're still glutton for more punishment, maybe we can do another one.
Well, I mean, your podcast's going to carry on infinitely, isn't it?
Pretty much. I mean, we took,
You're showing no signs of stopping.
I want to do one on the Flickr and Lexicon. I want to do one on, we've still got Hanley's books, and I heard that there was a piece of paper someone found a few weeks ago that had some letters and numbers on it that's probably fall related. We can get a couple of hours out of that. All right, everyone. Thanks. See you all later. Take care.
Cheers, Annie. See you soon.
Cheers all.
Feel free to go your own way and have a good day.
Sudden zoom back to that hotel room, tanked up, talking jive. It's 1985, just outside Rotterdam with the Fall Man. He was our guide to getting pie-eyed and totally fried as we broke on through to the other side. Last summer, I thought about him and I just cried. And then today they said that Mark had gone and died. Krishnan told the news of Smithy stuck in tragic blues with no way to lose his drinking shoes or his speaking views. But it's a sure bet that not everything is set by blokes on the news, the bourgeois crews who stumble and sweat over the cruel art threat. Because scorched on the ground, there's the mighty, mighty sound that got into you all, and that was the fall. It's left right here, that much is clear, or maybe even tangled, because a lot of his words, well, they came out mangled. But it was all there, the Pope growing a pear, Lovecraft in his lair, getting drug sick with Philip K. Dick, spinning Billy the Scam with the Edinburgh Man. He made a whole new fable, just as soon as he was able, out of krautrock things, like a bat without wings, a blister on the strings, synths sounding broken, as something fearful was awoken in a swamp of the mind, set to leave it all behind. Going speeding on a train, clean out of his brain. burning the psychedelic flame like Blake meeting Rigsby in the back of a van, buzzing on a can with a line of snort and this or that cohort. This was a man with a crazy art plan, both